Monika Halkort currently lectures at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. Welcome, Monika. Her research focuses on the political and moral ecology of digital infrastructures and datafication. Darien and Monika will hold a conversation on how open data may fail humans, and I can't wait to learn more about what you're working on, Monika.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. We decided for the Conversational Forum because I've had quite a journey from researching data and moving more and more towards researching infrastructures. And despite the fact that Doug so kindly but overstatingly announced that I may have all the answers, I don't. So we decided really to share my trajectory and my experiences, because I think there are some issues in there that at least alert us or sensitize us to certain risks, fallacies, and ethical challenges that may shape and inform our practice without precisely assuming that there ever could be a finalized or fixed guideline for ethical management of open data or production of open data. Yeah, so but that's how this conversational forum basically came about.
And I'm really excited about it. And actually, I feel really inspired also by Doug's talk right now, because he put up a lot of points where I was like, oh, I'm going to ask that Monika as well now. However, I want to give the audience the opportunity to kind of get to know you better and your research. So can you just give us an insight on what you're researching and what your motivation is behind that? Because I also find your biography to be quite interesting.
Let me start like this. Well, my background is actually journalism, but I moved to academia out of a kind of a frustration with even public broadcasters. The space of media has shrunk quite tremendously, as you all know, and so it really triggered my interest to kind of reclaim a space to seriously explore and think about contemporary issues and questions of power, social justice, etc. And so decided really to move in the field of academia and continue my work there. And having always had this particular interest in the Arab world and the Middle East, I'm born Austrian, where the whole history of Holocaust kind of brings in an added dimension to this. I ended up in Lebanon researching the politics of data in Palestinian refugee camps. And what really triggered my interest here was that while I was doing my master's, one of the Palestinian camps in Lebanon was completely destroyed, bombed down to the ground. A space where 30,000 people lived for 70 years was overnight erased. So imagine a refugee community sitting there in very precarious conditions already, and finally losing once again for the second and third time in their life, everything they've ever had. Now, for everyone who's familiar with refugee camps, you probably know that refugee camps are very peculiar places because they are actually not meant to last. In the context of the Palestinian struggle and this ongoing unresolved question of colonization and national dispossession and the expulsion of the refugees, this state of temporariness has taken on a permanent form, meaning this society grew and grew over time, but always on this basis, well, one day we will return. So most of people's property ownership, land ownership, inheritance was regulated informally. It was by and large a very powerful and present space, but by and large undocumented. There was no map, there was no proper documentation who owned what and for what reason. So imagine against this backdrop, once such a space is bombed to the ground, on what basis could you possibly start to rebuilding it? This was basically the challenge that UNRWA, the main UN agency, and several other NGOs faced when they tried to come to the help of people and try to help them rebuild this space. Now, added to that comes that rebuilding the space was not only important for providing housing for the people, In the Palestinian context, these camps also have a very strong symbolic resonance. They are lived and embodied manifestations of the political violence that affected their lives tremendously up until this day, and of which almost nothing, no physical traces are left in Palestine proper. Well, Doug showed you the maps. If you Google, it's like an Israeli space, and there's no mention of maybe this Cafe Italia was once an Arab kebab place or whatever, right? So the struggle over maintaining some physical evidence of the historical dispossession that has taken place is increasingly slipping away under people's fingers. So this gave the reconstruction of the camp a special symbolic resonance, political resonance. Now, luckily, the Palestinian cause is still a very emotive cause in the Arab world. So very quickly you found a group of activist architects who volunteered to support the population and map the camps based on the oral history of the camp, based on their oral testimony. They literally sat with every single family, asking them, where did you live? How big was your house? How many floors, etc. And redrew based on people's testimony, the camp in its original or lived and embodied grown structure, right? Now, all this was organized as a participatory process, right? The community coming together as an act of national resistance, such it was understood, and collaborate to rebuild this camp. And I was very intrigued by this, and I found this a perfect opportunity to study what happens to community under such hard and precarious circumstance, to study the politics of data, how datafication changes or maybe even helps. What is it? Does the promise of open data hold up, right? Does the promise of participatory data collection hold up in such precarious circumstances? So I spent almost a year volunteering for this architect collective, etc., literally sitting with them and observing the entire process. And of course, everyone expected it, and there were several measures to caution for it. If you enter with powerful tools of mapping into a community who has just lost everything and nothing has remained, the risk of people cheating and lying simply out of desperation, right, was pretty high. Like you had a house of 50 square meters, and all of a sudden you come to the mapping committee and you say, well, I had a house, it was actually 100 square meters, right? And it had 5 instead of 3 floors, simply to maximize the return you can get from international money. So everyone was kind of expecting this, right? So there was then a commission to validate people's testimony, right? But who would you pick for such a position? So the people who were picked were kind of the community elders, mostly men, one has to say, who sat there interrogating the neighbors to ask whether it's actually true what people said. And so it turned out a lot of times cheating was going on. But most critically, this process of validating and verification opened up a whole new space for new lines of corruption, new lines of injustice, new lines of inequality to be produced, because you could simply buy the people in charge of validating and verifying the data, right? So very quickly you found that this apparently participatory, collectively produced open data became the most prized and valued currency in the camp, that was used strategically by individuals to maximize their own advantage at the expense of the rest of the community. So this whole promise of a participatory open data mapping project, of restoring the lived and embodied history of a desperate situation and of this camp, became really a capitalist enterprise where people were started to trade square meters to make money into their own pockets or to maximize their individual advantages. And I think the experience I had there is really indicative of many crisis situations that are often overlooked by NGOs who come with their well-meaning intentions, collecting data to the aid of people, completely overlooking or not even knowing and familiarizing themselves with the power dynamics already present in a community. In this case, a very patriarchal society led by corrupt community elders who pushed away all the women, social workers, etc., or youth community activists for that matter, and really turned this into a highly corrupt and corrupted enterprise, right? At the same time, what you also could observe is there was a tremendous wave of what I call narrative dispossession involved, because the camp existed up to this point in the lived and embodied memory, manifest in houses, but also in people's relationship to place. This was how the spatial history of the camp has existed and was kind of stored in lived and embodied databases, manifest in the structure of the city and in people's own hearts and minds, right? Once this memory was transformed into digital data, it all of a sudden came into the hands of all those international NGOs on which the community depended to get money, set on several hard drives, who could kind of, similar to Facebook, start to generate their own value out of this data for their own purposes and ends. That doesn't mean they were working against the community, but there is, and people were very sensitive about this, how Doug has mentioned it, how they are giving away all this data and all they are getting back is maybe a furniture check or a new house, while the data in the long run for these NGOs is of tremendous value for the production of donor reports, for the production of manuals, for the production for their own standing and reputation and future investment and future donor money they are able to attract, where the distribution of work, labor input and time dedicated to the process of data collection and the rewards to be generated through this data were highly unevenly distributed. And I think that applies to many of these open data and mapping projects in a humanitarian context. Sometimes you even face situations where another group I met in Lebanon, Médecins Frontières, who often go about using OpenStreetMap to map undocumented spaces, to make them available for the provision of aid, right? But what you end up seeing is situations where they were, for whatever reason, hunting volunteers in Lebanon to map villages somewhere in Africa to facilitate Médecins Frontières operations on the ground. Now that may sound innocent and quite useful, but in many cases, like in Rwanda, these maps ended up playing directly into the hands of warring parties and were used actually as a tool of warfare. So this remoteness, this ability by remote satellite technologies, remote viewing technologies to map any place in the world really that you feel entitled to map for whatever purpose, can become a very dangerous enterprise, even if conducted in the name of humanitarian purposes or the public good. I think Médecins Frontières and others have since become highly cautious about this, but you could equally also see it in the recent context of COVID, but also with Ebola in Africa, where contact tracing became a big issue. And people were eager to kind of trace all the affected people for their contacts, etc., overlooking how this information in village contexts quite often doesn't remain protected, enclosed and behind only in the hands of medical professionals. Very quickly, this information spread out and certain people were simply expelled out of the village because it became known that they are infected, right? So issues of privacy take on a whole new dimension in settings where people do not necessarily, where the digital and the analog precisely intersect and meet is basically what I'm trying to say. And for me, that meant really taking these experiences on board really led me to think the issue is not so much data as such. It has been mentioned many times. There's nothing inherently good or bad about data. It really is about looking at the particular kind of relations in which we exist as and with data, and the wider force field of power and institutional infrastructures that are involved, and through which this data is then processed in general.
I do wanted to ask one more question about the relationship, because in our preparational talk, we talked about you touched upon the topic of the complex relationship between marine biology surveillance and border control, and how it can foster racism or inhumane practices as well. Would like you to expand on that for a bit?
Yeah. It really is, out of this interest in relationships, I was very much interested in these real-time tracking technologies. And here, quite interestingly, in this intersection of environmental and Earth observation satellites that are basically there to monitor the dire state of the planet, to collect very important and relevant data to monitor and contain climate change. But also how it really intersects and never lost its very intimate connection to apparatuses of capitalism and the military. This relationship between science, capitalism, and military operations is historically grown historically out of the experience of colonialism and the conquest of the world, but actually has never left us. And I think it became quite manifest to observe in the context of the migration crisis in the Mediterranean Sea, where you can see, on one hand, Earth observation satellites used very intensively to intimately study rising sea levels, rising sea temperatures, which is critical information to understand climate change and how it affects the Mediterranean coast. And yet, at the same time, so it really grew into a very expensive and elaborate infrastructures where scientists not only rely on satellite images looking at the sea from the sky, but also on small little floating objects capable of measuring rising sea temperatures, even below the ground, and tweeting literally this information back. They are connected to communication satellites in space, tweeting this information back to data centers of scientists, right? Looking into these infrastructures and how their real-time communication capacities, I'm like, this is odd. We now understand and are able to read and map the sea, which is vast and impossible to observe, even with the most detailed observational satellites, if you only rely on a totalizing satellite image view. But these floating sensors break up this territory into small little geographical chunks and areas, which are much easier to track and trace. So knowing this, you immediately ask yourself the question, how, if the sea is directly connected and communicating with data centers, how is it that human bodies drown next to these real-time sensing capacities? And here you realize that all these powerful instruments of real-time data gathering, right, doesn't matter whether it's open or not. It's the way in which these infrastructures are mobilized to attend to situations of risk and to the risk of premature death in particular, where you see how the institutional infrastructures, once again, within which these infrastructures are mobilized, are very much still grounded in a very rigid distinction between the natural sciences and the human sciences or the social sciences, between apparatuses of the study of nature and apparatus of securitization. Interestingly enough, the police, as the Pentagon as well as Frontex, increasingly use environmental data and use this data to monitor the movement of ships, the movement of smuggling vessels, etc., but never use it for the purpose of rescuing people. that is kind of outside the operational mandate within which this infrastructure is used. And it's on that basis that I speak of racialized habits of sense, where you see institutional divisions, legacies of dividing environments into social environments and natural environments, dividing the responsibility of protection between different disciplines. On one hand, humanitarian agencies, on the other hand, environmental researchers, where you see new hierarchies of protection and new hierarchies of risk and vulnerability emerging that of course take on racialized dimension once you realize that it's black and brown bodies that are drowning in the sea for the sake of, while the sea is intensely monitored for the sake of protection of white northern industrialized European nations to protect themselves not only from the migrants, but also from the effects of climate change. It's I'm condensing a very complex argument here into a very tiny accessible space, but I hope I was able to answer your question.
Which is nonetheless infuriating, to be honest. I wanted to ask, touching on what Doug said, that maybe you know how we move forward from here. Maybe you have a brief answer so we can also open the questions to the floor.
Well, I think Doug mentioned very many of the most important points, which can only be their own kind of guiding map of what to look out for, while still remaining always open to new challenges and problems. But I think the point you mentioned about never assume a data set to be complete, I would kind of link to that and add to that. Always ask yourself, or start with the questions, who or what is represented in this data, and most importantly, who or what is left out? What are the gaps, not only in terms of people or objects or animals and plants for that matter missing, but what are the underlying assumptions under which this data has been produced, and what is thereby silenced, overlooked, or sidelined, or no longer visible as a problem in the first place, right? And I think starting from these gaps can be as instructive and a data point in and of itself to work with, rather than the actual digital data points that you have gathered in whatever context and for whatever purpose. So for me, speaking from a feminist perspective of the Global South, that would be my starting point to take it from there. And always to ask how this, and I think with COVID, we've seen it quite impressively. There are all these kind of spectacular data models, and I think this goes far beyond the question even of data literacy, right? You can train people to understand what data does, or would you have been able to understand the speculative modeling that we have seen and been confronted with day after day with the COVID modelings? No way. We have not the capacity, and you can't train an entire population to understand the politics of speculation that is involved in how this data then ends up being used in data models to make prognostics, to speculate lockdown or not, right? Or herd immunity in the case of Britain. And so looking at the gaps, looking at who is left out and whose voices are really silenced, is my recommendation as a starting point, and really mobilize the gaps as a starting point for interventions. And I think most importantly, to not lose sight, to always and continue to insist on thinking data and the bodies behind them, the data, the bodies and actions from which they were retrieved, to think them as a unity. Meaning, always ask yourself back the question, how is this affecting this very particular person, the very particular community I'm working with, and the politics already in place? Is it amplified? What are the risks of amplifying inequalities, power imbalances, or maybe helping to resolve them?
Thank you so much, Monika. I want to open the floor for the audience to ask questions if they have any.
I just wanted to add one thing to the final, to Doug's question, to this recommendation, what to do with open geographic data. I don't even think it's a question of either or, either holding the producers accountable to certain ethical or political standards, or educating the population. Of course, they have to go together, right? Because otherwise, it's media literacy and data literacy is, of course, important, but that should never stop us from placing very specific responsibilities on these producers and the people benefiting the most from the data.
Thank you so much. It's very infuriating, but also inspiring at the same time. I hope I make myself clear when I say that like that. Please, audience, do you have any questions? I see just like one favorite quote, but I'm not gonna ask that. I have actually, like, I wrote down a few questions, and I wonder like how it is for you. Now you've worked for a while on this complex relationship, on seeing that there is a lot of injustice also in the utilization of data, or how it is collected and also how it is shared. And I do wonder if you would have looked at yourself a couple of years back, or what kind of advice you have for people just starting on that journey right now in the kind of analyzation of the complex relationship and open data, and how we can like kind of make peace with it and also move forward from there. I'm kind of looking for advice in this kind of realm.
I think, again, linking up to what Doug said, I think that the shared output of my experience with it is really to stop treating data as this kind of special issue that now has come into our lives that needs special attention to be dealt with. It is part and parcel, ingrained in the political and social struggles we always had, will always have. It just added new layers to it, but you can never deal and confront them outside of them. And again, coming back to the question of the digital and the analog, I think the most important question here was really not only to stop thinking in these binaries, but even with the question of open data, between open and closed, there's so many shades of gray in between. And I think some of the most promising examples I have seen is to not fall for either one of those directions as the ideal, but to skillfully play with the scope of possibilities between open and closed data, full transparency and opacity, and find your way there. And again, to draw an example in the Mediterranean Sea, one of the most powerful interventions to protect the refugees I've seen is Alarmphone, which is a real-time telephone hotline run by volunteers, which is really a network of, you have one phone number, but you split it across a number of 100 volunteers who do phone shifts on a daily basis, taking emergency calls from migrants running into situations of emergency directly in the sea. Now, it works best, of course, with a satellite phone, because how would you make a phone call in the middle of the sea? But iPhones, and once you're close in coastal areas, they still tend to work quite nicely. And the way it works, it's really low tech. It's mobile phones. It's a routing technology that distributes these calls across a number of volunteers who keep track, who then, and people tweeting their geolocation data. And what happens once you call this alarm phone, they will call the next available Marine Coast Guard and push them to send out the rescue vessel to come and rescue you. Or they communicate with one of the NGOs who are already in the sea monitoring and come to the aid of refugees. How this number became known was really word by mouth. A priest visited a Libyan prison where a lot of refugees sat, wrote the phone number on a wall. And ever since, this number has been passed on over generations. Now they have a website, of course, and everyone knows it. But it really is a very low-tech solution to a very immediate problem. And it far surpasses, or it skillfully fills the gap that's missing between the Earth observation satellites used by Frontex for the sake of policing and the very localized environmental centers used to measure sea temperatures. It's a middle ground, a way in between, using the little communication possibilities that are there to really make a meaningful intervention that also is within the means of those migrants and refugees trying to reach Europe. So it's a skillful and it's completely based on trust, of course, right? So again, the communication means without the backing of a network of trusted individuals and trusted technologies, it wouldn't work. So singling out data alone, data in and of itself, yes, you can do a lot of it. But I think once you enter the realm of making a political difference, a lot more is at stake and needed to make it work.
We have a question from the audience. Thank you, Monika. From Sabine, who asked, would you say the human connection is always more important than data, and we need to watch to not get distracted by data?
I don't distinguish between humans and data. Every data point is in terms of our ethical, social, and political responsibilities, inextricably bound up with certain bodies, with certain relationships, with certain actions. So to think of them as separate or one overwhelming the other, no. If you think them as one ontological unit, the question actually doesn't even arise. But it's kind of idealistic to say this. I understand where the question is coming from, because these extractive practices allow precisely these dispossessions and abstractions to reduce people to individual data points of random activities. Of course, makes this exploitation possible. But I think here a lot can be done on the level of regulation and how data can be used or not for specific purposes. But again, only, and all these policies inevitably, from my point of view, need to be informed by this very understanding. We are not talking about data. We are talking about a new physical manifestation of lived and embodied relationships, needs, interests, and situations to be attended to.
Yeah, but which are caused by the misuse or the let's say restricted collection of those data points. No, that's how I understood it. I mean, like there you have, especially like in the sea, you have this issue of one institution collecting data and not using it for the good of humanity, right?
No, using it for the good of a certain section of humanity, right? The paradox here is really that with climate change, with the Anthropocene, we are facing a planetary threat of extinction, right? No one will survive. So natural sciences go out there with their powerful apparatuses, studying for the sake of the survival of the planet at large, studying the sea in minute detail. Now, the study requires, the paradox is, to achieve that, you have to do this on the level of data proxies. You can't read the sea temperature of the sea directly. You need several data proxies, indirect measurements, from which to calculate and speculate what is going to happen in the future and how is it going to affect the planet, but also specific communities at large. So already we are getting used to thinking about our place in the world, our relationship to nature and the environment, no longer on the basis of direct and immediate experience, but through this added layer of abstraction in chemical, geophysical, geological data points for the sake of planetary survival, which is a pretty holistic perspective to think about the future of societies today. And yet somehow we still manage to exclude certain segments of the population out of the calculation. It sounds to me completely absurd, kind of not to so selectively mobilize the new ways of seeing environmental data enables us, in particular under the pretext of containing risks of premature death. Whose death? Who is missing from this data? What kind of death and threats are made visible by these environmental studies? And what kind of death and risks of vulnerability are left out, and why? It would be naive to accuse a natural marine biologist for not attending to the refugees. How could he? He's trained in paleontology, marine biology. He doesn't even have the mandate, right? But to not make this data and the infrastructure available for these purposes, I think is a severe political failure on our part as societies. And I think as much as open data and opening data has been important, I think the next step is opening infrastructures. It's making these infrastructures available to all sorts of purposes and ends. And the question of misuse or abuse, it's already happening anyway, right? If you've read the piece about the hacking into the NGOs, the rescue boats, the question of misuse or abuse will always be there, but to meaningfully use satellite images or environmental data, you need to know quite something, right? It cannot be done by anyone. So it's limited to certain people with the technical and the scientific skills to do that, right? So that shouldn't be used as an excuse to not open these infrastructures for civilian purposes.
I think you're making an incredibly strong call for really acting on our responsibility all as data stewardships in one, and also to understand data not as just this one linear kind of, I don't know, Excel sheet, for instance, but a very holistic set of data, with also while acknowledging that we are missing out so much in order to really understand the whole picture.
It's a process to really think about the process of communication and exchange and the material basis on which this data is even comes into the world and is made available.